for having me here. I was talking earlier. I said there aren't a lot of good things that came out of the pandemic, but one of the good things is the fact that I get the opportunity to meet with colleagues and friends from all around the country with regularity now. And so, of course, it would be hard to be there today, but to be able to be there via Zoom and for you to actually see my face, and I'm sure all of you have cameras. If we turned them on, we could all see each other. That's just a really neat thing that we're able to accomplish. So let me share my screen here and we will get this show on the road. Move a couple things. Okay, so as was mentioned, Larry, I thank you for the great introduction. I'm Ben Bowers, assistant professor at Auburn University. I do a lot of work with the National Center for Asphalt Technology, or NCAT, which some of you may have heard about. We have a big test track that a lot of folks pay a lot of attention to. So that was a part of the big draw for me as someone whose background is in predominantly asphalt materials, but I do study pavements in general, broadly. So today I'm going to talk about something that really popped onto my radar a couple of years ago through a project that the National Asphalt Pavement Association wanted me to look into. And basically what they wanted to know is, we're hearing more and more about this resilience concept, and we don't really know what that is as it applies to pavements. It's not really well defined. And so I worked on a project for them. The report actually came out just today, and I'll share that with you guys here at the end of the meeting. But through that process, and as someone with a background in sustainability, I've spent a lot of time understanding this resilience concept and how it's interlinked with sustainability, and then also thinking about the practical implications. And so what you're going to learn about today is we're going to go through a conversation about what the heck is resilience? What does that mean for us? How is that different from sustainability, which is another buzzword that we've been hearing a lot about? And then I'm going to walk through some practical applications and provide some case examples with you, as well as share some insight on how you might be able to apply what I refer to as resilience thinking to your projects today. Not having to come up with the next new technology, that's definitely a part of this, as you'll see, but we've got plenty of tools at our fingertips as engineers today that we can be using to make our system more resilient. So without further ado, let's first talk about why this talk is important. I've got a series of photos here. There are many more we could have offered. I'm a native North Carolinian, and this picture in the top right might look familiar to anyone who is also from North Carolina or who paid any attention to the news after Hurricane Florence rolled through North Carolina. That river there, that's actually Interstate 40 running out to the coast. So I-40 completely underwater, as shown up here in the top left. You guys might remember hearing about Hurricane Michael just a couple years ago in 2019. Category 5 storm happened overnight, slammed into Mexico Beach in Florida, basically wiped it off the map. Tyndall Air Force Base was underwater. They lost a good chunk of their lab. Was having a conversation shortly thereafter with them about the issues they saw. Something we don't think about as much is the impact of drought and then precipitation on our infrastructure and extreme precipitation after drought. Picture on the top right is actually an 8-month-old pavement here in Alabama. It's on top of a full depth reclamation layer. And there's expansive clays, which I know I've got friends on here from Texas. That's something you guys are familiar with for sure. These expansive clays, we're seeing the impacts of drought and extreme precipitation, and it's having negative effects more rapidly on some of our infrastructure. At the bottom left, you see a picture that was taken here in Alabama of some erosion that has occurred in a stream bed and is actually built up underneath the bridge. That bridge used to have clearance over that stream. It doesn't anymore. The bottom center, you see Hurricane Sally, which rolled through Mobile, Alabama, and parts of the Florida Panhandle just last year, and the amount of rainfall it dumped on our state. And then in the bottom right, you see the impacts of a landslide up near Huntsville, Alabama. And this problem was brought on after extreme rain. That's what they think led to the problem. Larry, you mentioned coldest day in a very long time, the second coldest on record in Oklahoma and down into Texas last year. My friends in Louisiana, Texas, Florida, we all saw a lot of hurricanes this year. We're seeing with relative frequency extreme climate events. And while we obviously think about the impact it has on us as individuals, what we're really starting to think about more and more is the impact it has on our infrastructure. So we're going to be talking about that today. So what is resilience? And I think it's important for us to look at the Federal Highway Administration definition as civil engineers or folks in the roadway building or transportation sector. Resilience is described in a 2014 FHWA Order 5520. You guys can Google that, it'll show up, you'll see the entire order. They define resilience as the ability to anticipate, prepare for, and adapt to changing conditions and withstand, respond to, and recover rapidly from disruptions. So it's the ability to bounce back. It's the ability to withstand climate events. It doesn't have to just be climate. It can be man-made events such as acts of terror and things like that. Another term that's important to understand is also defined in that order, and that is the term adaptation. Adaptation is defined as the adjustment in a natural or human system in anticipation of or response to a changing environment in a way that effectively uses beneficial opportunities or reduces negative effects. So, all right, Bowers, you just gave me a ton of words. What does that mean practically? So let's think about our situation right now. Resilience is not just an infrastructure thing. It's a psychological thing. It's a social thing. It's something that we have to have as individuals. We just rounded the 1 year mark of being in this global pandemic. And while we were shut down for a chunk of time and many of us didn't quite know what to do with regard to work, we adapted. Right now, we are showing adaptation. We have bounced back from this pandemic in a way. We're not completely over it. We're not back to normal, but we've adapted in a way that allows us to communicate through things like Zoom. I had to go out and buy a new webcam because I wanted to be able to see the people I was talking to more easily. So there are many other examples of this, but this is one that we're living right now. Our adaptation to the COVID-19 pandemic is showing our resilience as people. We didn't stop working. We didn't stop communicating because of this issue. So maybe that's just a kind of a practical at-home example that you're living at this moment that gives you an idea of the scope of what we're going to be applying to our pavements. So in terms of adaptation, what are the things we need to adapt to? We need to adapt to all different changing conditions. That might be temperature swings, such as the record highs or the record lows that we mentioned a minute ago, as well as, as a pavements person, I think not just about highs and lows. I can plan for that. It's hard to plan for massive swings in temperature from really low temps to really high temps. Things like we saw out in Colorado just this last year. We have to think about wildfires. We have to think about hurricanes. Major non-tropical precipitation events. Right now, for those of you who are in Louisiana or look outside and you see rain, well, guess what? We're in the same storm system. It is raining here now. Parts of North Alabama are currently flooding due to yet another extreme precipitation event that we're having to handle. Has nothing to do with a hurricane or a tropical event. We have to think about tornadoes, sea level rise, and then as I mentioned earlier, drought. So this is, NOAA puts together every year the $1 billion weather and climate disasters. This is the 2018. You see everything from hurricanes along the coast to tornadoes in the southeast and up into the Midwest. You see hailstorms, you see droughts, wildfires. Let's go to 2019. You see flooding. We're going to talk today about flooding in Iowa. I'm going to give that as a case example. Again, more hurricanes, more wildfires, lots of severe weather. And then, of course, this is 2020, which was one for the record books in terms of hurricanes. I didn't know you could run out of names. Some of you may have already known that. That was news to me. So, of course, we start rolling out our Greek alphabet, which I had to relearn to understand what hurricane name we might have next. So, as you all see, we're dealing with more and more billion-dollar weather events in this country. This is not just for us, this is for the globe. Everyone is starting to see a lot of these types of events occur. Now, I want to pause real quickly. I mentioned earlier, I'm going to talk about what the difference is between sustainability and resilience because, as especially as we start seeing new infrastructure funding bills and things like that were talked about earlier. Been to a number of meetings where, unfortunately, these words have been used somewhat interchangeably. People don't totally understand the difference. So I wanted to pause for just a second and talk about the difference. I pulled a quote here because I thought that these folks said it better than I ever could. They noted that resilience concerns with the capacity of, in this example they give, is an urban system. So this includes the natural, built, social, and economic elements to manage change, learn from difficult situations, and be in a position to, and this is key, rebound after experiencing significant stress or shock. Sustainability, on the other hand, questions whether or not certain aspects of our daily activities and the systems in which we operate can be continued indefinitely into the future from a, and this is the old triple bottom line you are all familiar with, social, economic, and environmental perspectives. So one is concerned with bouncing back after an event. The other is concerned about being able to continue using our resources indefinitely and thinking about the next generation while also making sure our economy continues to roll and that we're not taking a financial hit for it. So that's the difference between sustainability and resilience, and that's important to remember. Now, I put together in this report that I'm going to show you guys at the end this kind of Venn diagram about the fact that resilience and sustainability are not the same thing, even though they often get used improperly, interchangeably. And again, this was for asphalt, but you can go into the concrete industry or many other industries and be able to make a very similar Venn diagram. So in green, what you see is sustainable practices or attributes of asphalt materials. In the gold color, you see resilient practices or attributes that are not considered sustainable. And then the overlap is sustainable and resilient practices. Now, what you see here is that if you were to lay out all the sustainable practices, and I use some very short terms here to define these, that's a pretty big scope. Resilience is a little bit smaller. And then you'll notice that the overlap between the two, a significant number of the resilient attributes are also considered sustainable. So what are the differences? So some examples of sustainable practices or attributes that are not necessarily considered resilient is the use of recycled materials, cold recycled asphalt, or things like asphalt mix and plant optimization. If I optimize my asphalt plant so that I'm using less energy, that's not really a resilience, helping the resilience of the system. Now, in terms of resilient practices that are not sustainable, using novel materials with unknown environmental or safety risks. So we have lots of materials that roll out that, to be honest, we may know they're safe, but we don't know what the energy use and things like that, how much greenhouse gas was emitted making these novel materials. Using climate adaptable materials when the social and environmental benefits do not outweigh the cost. So things like using polymer modified binders for low volume roads, when normally we would focus those on a high volume interstate type route. Or simply over designing for a low risk catastrophic event. So something that's probably not going to happen, we're going to over design just in case. It is not a sustainable practice. Now, in terms of overlap, things we see are like warm mix asphalt, which originally rolled out onto the market as a way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and get better construction quality. Well, it's considered a resilient practice because it allows us to increase haul distances. So an example of this, Hurricane Michael occurred. They needed to get mix out to repair the road. Traffic was backed up so far that it took them 4 hours to get from the plant to the job site. So basically one dump truck could make one round a day in an 8-hour shift. So that mix, that hot mix asphalt was sitting in the back of that truck. Well, they were able to produce at high temperatures, use the warm mix additive, and it kept the viscosity low enough that they were able to place the material in the road and repair the road, which ultimately led to getting traffic moving again so that they decreased that queue time. So that's an example there of taking a sustainable practice and making it into a resilient one. Porous pavement systems, these are designed to deal with storm water. They can also help handle nuisance flooding. Perpetual pavement or long life pavement design for major critical corridors. We have things like deep reconstruction of pavement to increase deep layer moduli. Our ability to adjust our design to climate and climate events to extend pavement life. So these are some examples of things that can be considered sustainable as well as resilient. So hopefully you guys out there that are listening to this, the first time you've really thought about resilience, are starting to understand that, look, These are different things, but in many cases they are linked. We can't use them interchangeably, but they do overlap. So they're part of the grander system. All right, so let's shift back into resilience now that we've discussed these differences. So what effect might these climate events and things like that have on our pavements? You know, I sat through, and I'm sure that Elizabeth Habeck from FHWA is going to present at one of the future webinars or present some of this data, and you'll get to take a firsthand look at it. But I went to a peer exchange and participated in that. It was a lot of state agencies, and they asked them, they said, what is your biggest concern when it comes to the resilience of your pavement system? The number one thing they said is flood inundation. And then also on that category was things like rising groundwater tables due to sea level rise, so at your coastal regions, that ultimately lead to premature pavement deterioration. So flood inundation, whether you're on the coast or whether you're along the Mississippi River, these are things that agencies are seriously concerned about right now. Another is extreme temperatures, which can lead to rutting, cracking, or buckling of your pavement. That's the first thing I used to think about when I thought about resilience. It's like, oh, it's super high temperatures or super low temperatures. Those lead to pavement failures. Destruction of materials production plants due to climate events or disruptions. So this is something we don't think about as much. We think a lot about the pavement system. We think about making sure it stays open. But if a hurricane comes on board and it knocks out our asphalt plant or our concrete plant that is used to repair the road, we've got a big problem, because we don't have what we need to get the materials out there to fix it. You can see where that's an issue. So this is something I'm encouraging the asphalt industry to pay attention to, which is let's start thinking also about how we can make our plants more resilient so that we can repair the roads that get taken out due to a catastrophic event. And then finally, things like rerouting of trucks or demolition removal, damaging pavements after a disruption. So basically, you know, a roadway floods or a roadway is taken out by some kind of catastrophic climate disruption, and we still got to move our goods. And so what do? They reroute to another road. Typically, it's a lower volume road that was not designed to have that many semis. And so not only do you then, as an agency, have to repair the road that's failed, you also are now faced with the problem of you're going to get premature failure or less life out of the road that all those tractor trailers were moving back and forth on that you never anticipated tractor trailers would be on. So we call this a cascading event. And I'm going to provide an example of this. So I came to Auburn in 2018 from Virginia. Again, lived in North Carolina, lived in Tennessee, where I went to grad school. In those three states, especially East Tennessee, where you're in the mountains, you can get a tornado, but you're not really that worried about them. If you get one, they're usually really small. So it's never been something I've been super concerned about. Now, I remember when the EF5 moved through Tuscaloosa and the University of Alabama a number of years ago, and I have some family that lives down here that lives in a neighboring town that was literally wiped off the face of the earth. So I saw that firsthand when I came to visit, and I said to myself, you know, I really need to like double check and see what I need to be prepared for moving to Auburn. So I looked up like 30 years worth of data, very limited tornadic activity in this region. If there was one, it was a really small one, definitely no loss of life, maybe a little bit of property damage, but nothing that I would worry about too much. So anyway, I moved my family here, my wife, and at the time, my young daughter, and we get settled in. That fall, I start teaching, and then I have a conference out in Fort Worth. Interestingly enough, I'm sitting in a session on climate change impacts on pavements, and my phone starts going off, and we were calling for bad weather. Well, it's my wife, and we're under a tornado warning, the first one since we moved, and it just happened to be an EF4 tornado that ran through Beauregard, which you guys may have heard about back in 2018. So let me turn on my pointer here. This was not something you wanted to hear. So this is Auburn, downtown Auburn. I live kind of up here. This is the pathway of the EF4 Beauregard tornado, which is kind of unheard of in this area. So I was really pleased to find out that the first tornado warning, after I had kind of worried about this and had talked myself out of the worry, happened to be a massive tornado that unfortunately cost people their lives and destroyed a lot of property. So any of you who have been through a tornadic event nearby or had to help manage rebuilding after one, You might know or recognize this truck here in the middle. These are the trucks that come from FEMA. They're contracted. They are permitted to be way overweight. So this truck empty is almost at the legal load limit. And you can see it as a crane. It picks up debris, vegetative debris, and then hauls it to a vegetative burn pit. So what you'll see here is the pathway. So they came and picked up debris all along this path, and they funneled up here. Interestingly enough, the NCAT pavement test track is about here where my cursor is. And right across the street is an old quarry that they used to burn the vegetation after these types of things happen. This happened once before with a much smaller tornado, as I alluded to. So this happens in March. In about June, I get a phone call from one of our local highway department folks, and they said, can you come out and look, we're having some premature failure. Basically, the roads that collected all these trucks to lead to the vegetation burn pit started failing prematurely, and they weren't quite sure what to do. This is a cascading event. When this occurred, we didn't anticipate the impact it was going to have on our roads. It didn't destroy our roads. The tornado had no effect on our roadways. But the aftermath, the damage removal, had a major effect. So we need to be thinking about how we might prepare for something like this. This is the second time we've used this vegetative burn pit for this reason. Perhaps we need to harden these roads a bit so that they can withstand this type of event. So it's just an example of this cascading event concept that I wanted to share with you. So to be resilient, we need to do a few things. First, we need to understand our vulnerabilities. What are the weak points in our asset or our system? How might these be impacted in an event like a natural disaster? So we need to answer those questions. We then need to assess the risk associated with those vulnerabilities. There might be parts of the country where, yes, it is possible to get a tropical cyclone or hurricane, but it's a really low probability. So if it's a low risk, maybe we don't do anything right now. But if it's a high risk, perhaps we need to consider things that we can employ that can help us handle that risk and balance that risk. And what are the consequences if we do nothing? And then finally, once we've answered those two questions, we need to adapt. So use tools to adapt the system from its original design to account for resilient needs. So what exactly do we do? How do we approach that? So I'm going to present to you now 4 philosophies or adaptation philosophies. And I told you there's some case studies. So each one of these has it's a very short case study that gives an example of what each of these might look like. So our first philosophy, and this is the one that most of us, when we start thinking about resilience, this is where we go. And this is the idea of hardening or strengthening or armoring our system. So this is when we strengthen, rebuild, or protect our pavement to withstand any probable event that the pavement might be subjected to, and eliminate or nearly eliminate any disruption potential. Now, our second option, and this is probably one that we're going to more realistically be able to employ, considering much of our infrastructure already exists, is adapting it through modification. So this is when we make adjustments to our pavement as it is, perhaps not completely hardening it, but giving it a higher probability that it would survive a disruption or be able to recover really quickly from a disruption because it's not completely destroyed. Our option number 3, sometimes it makes sense to just accept that this might happen and plan for it. So we're not going to harden it. We're not going to adapt it. But what we're going to do is accept that we may have a complete failure, account for that risk, and plan for funds and people to be made available to address the problem quickly. This might be things like rapid contracting or having what a lot of us in our bank accounts refer to as a rainy day fund that we can tap into, an emergency fund to repair quickly and get the public moving again. And then finally, and this is the one no one likes to think about, is the idea of abandonment. Sometimes we have to take an honest look at the situation and decide that it makes more financial sense to completely abandon the route altogether and either reroute or have to, and there's a big equity problem here, have to move a community. So these are things we need to be thinking about. These are the 4 different design philosophies. So I want to dig a little bit into each one of these over the next couple of minutes and provide these case studies. So the first one we're going to talk about is hardening. So this is when we strengthen the system to withstand flooding, wave action. So when waves break over our pavement as flooding is occurring on the coast due to a hurricane, the rerouting of traffic, the cascading events that could occur like the EF4 tornado and the heavy trucks that were moving debris. So we're going to strengthen or armor it to withstand this. And doing this may take many forms, and these are not the only 4 options. One is to do things like build protective structures like levees to keep water away. Let's keep it out. It can look like elevating the system. When a pavement is prone to flooding, the first thing people want to do, it seems like, is build it up. Let's lift it up, which can cost lots of money, but it solves the problem. We could build perpetual asphalt pavement systems or long life pavements. So these are really deep to handle stresses and push them deep into the pavement where they're going to dissipate. You're not going to induce premature cracking. If a pavement is inundated, the subgrade gets weakened. That weak subgrade means weak support, and that can cause cracking to initiate. We designed that pavement to be perpetual. We should be able to withstand a flood or an inundation scenario like that. And another option, stabilize the base of the pavement. Let's just harden it completely from the base up to get rid of the base failure issue that can be brought on due to a climate disruption. So let's give an example. You guys might think back and remember the flooding that occurred in Iowa and in the Midwest back in 2019. So when the Missouri River flooded, the first flood was 2019 in March. The second flood was in May. So it's kind of back to back. It was caused by rapid snowmelt and heavy rainfall. And this was the second 500-year flood that they had in 10 years. Now, statistically, that is totally possible. Just because you have one doesn't mean the next year you can't. You still have the same statistical probability, but it is a little expected to have 2 500-year floods in a 10-year period. So, I don't know about you guys. Sometimes, well, not now that I live in Auburn in a college town, but back when I lived in Charlotte and some other larger cities, I would wake up and I would often check the traffic cam to figure out what the route to work was going to look like, how traffic was looking. So you can imagine if you lived in Iowa, just outside of Omaha, you wake up, you check your traffic cam, this is what you see. That is not good. So you can see this is a part of Interstate 29 right at I-680. Again, this is just inside Iowa near Omaha, Nebraska, completely underwater in different portions due to this flooding. And this is the aftermath. And what I want to point out here is that no pavement was left behind. On the far right, you see asphalt. Bill Rosner, who at the time was with the Iowa Asphalt Pavement Association, pointed out, look, we call asphalt pavements flexible. Check out that shoulder. It's a wave. It's very flexible. I was like, it's a good joke there. The center, you see a rigid pavement. And what you see is undermining there, and you see the shoulder panels laying over completely. On the far left, those are actually an adaptive strategy that was put in place to handle this type of event. Those are some concrete block erosion mats that'll help keep erosion down. And unfortunately, they had some anchor failures. So they were actually pulled away from the pavement. You can see further down, they did not have those anchor failures. And so it was left in place and protected the pavement. So no pavement system was left behind. So how'd they address this? Well, undermining was the big issue here. Water would get underneath the shoulder and in some cases all the way under the pavement structure itself. Iowa DOT had to shut down the interstate, and they noted that the road closure costs about $200,000 a day in user costs. So they needed to get it open ASAP. Now they looked, and a section in the first 500-year flood back in 2011 that they designed, it was a rigid concrete section. It fared really well in the first 2019 flood. So when they were figuring out what they were going to do, they said, all right, we want to have 2 options here. We're going to have a concrete option and an asphalt option. We're going to design our asphalt pavement to be a structural equivalent. They designed it using Per Road, which is a perpetual pavement design software, to determine what the HMA thickness would have to be a structural equivalent. And ultimately that, in this case, is who won the bid. So they went back and built a perpetual section so that if this happens again, we may be able to completely eliminate the road closure and be able to get traffic back out there as soon as the floodwaters reside, like they were able to do with the rigid section. So now let's move to our second strategy. This is the idea of adaptation through modification. So this is probably what we'll see a little more of as we think about resilience, because so much of our infrastructure is built, we don't necessarily have the money to go back and completely rebuild it. We have the ability to upgrade it. So let's talk about that. So we may not be able to afford that reconstruction, like I said just a second ago, but we can make changes to help withstand disruptions. And this can take a number of different forms. It can look like using climate adaptable materials in future maintenance treatments. So maybe when we go out and do an asphalt overlay, we put polymer in it when we normally wouldn't do that to help stiffen the mix and give it a little more elasticity. We may capitalize and put in natural or nature-based features, or what the acronym for that is NNBF. This has gotten a lot of attention. You look at work that NOAA and FHWA has done, especially along the coast, using things like marshes and those types of dunes even to help limit the amount of flooding, to limit the amount of wave action that can occur on the pavement on a coastal route during something like a hurricane or a major tidal event. It doesn't completely protect the road, but it does lower the fact that the probability the disruption is going to take the road out. We can also do things like innovative site-specific additions to slow or prevent future deterioration. So we might go back and add drainage into our pavement section where we didn't have drainage before. So let's look at some examples of this. I want to go back to Iowa. You guys remember this photo? We talked about how undermining was a big challenge, despite the fact that there were guards in place, such as those erosion mats. So some things they did to prevent future issues. One thing they did, they had the right of way to work with, is they paved an extra shoulder out. And this was actually done on the fly. This is where the agency and the contractor, they were worried they were going to get yet another flood before they were even getting this road completely open. And so what they said was, hey, we noticed a lot of the undermining happened under the shoulders. What if we pave an extra shoulder so that we force the undermining out from the safety shoulder? If we have undermining under that, who cares? We can go repair that. We don't have to close the road. The public can travel safely. Another thing they did was they installed an asphalt wedge over the erosion mat to help ensure that it stayed in place. And then finally, what they did is while they were out there, they went ahead and installed under drains at the edge of the main line. I thought it was interesting. Dr. Scott Schramm with the Iowa DOT said, hey, you know, we realized too that if we put it at the edge of the main line, not at the edge of the shoulder, it tended to not clog as much. We tended to not have issues. It drained better. So they upgraded it by adding drainage to help handle any future events like this. So these are some examples of what that adaptation may look like to the existing pavement structure. They didn't necessarily go back and completely rebuild the pavement here. You can see there on the large picture that you can see the original pavement off to the left, but they did bring that extra shoulder out to help protect it. So then our third option, what does it look like to just accept that this might happen and plan for it? So sometimes it's most fiscally responsible because we have limited budgets to say, look, this route may fail. We're going to accept that risk and we're going to plan for the recovery. So ways we might do that is let's first understand the routes that are at risk and prioritize them in accordance with appropriate resilient approaches. So if we have an evacuation route, a major economic driver, you know, where a lot of freight moves or there's a lot of businesses, we might say, hey, that's something we want to invest in hardening. Now we might have some major secondary routes that we're like, look, we can't harden them. We have a lot of traffic on them. They're keys to getting people to and from. We're going to adapt those roads through maintenance treatments, or we're going to go in and do some reclamation work, something like that. But we're not going to completely harden them. Then we might have some old farm roads, some neighborhood streets that it's important for us to get them open because there are people in that community that use that road every day. But we can't afford or justify the cost to go out and do a major overhaul of it or adapt it in any way. So we're going to accept that it might fail. We're going to put plans in place to repair it rapidly. So that's how we would go through that prioritization process. So what's really important here is the communication between the industry and the agency. You need to get together and develop a coordinated plan regarding the details of the response. You need a process, and it needs to be clear. Trust is something that came up a lot when I hosted my workshop for Napa, when I was talking to agencies who have been through these events, contractors who have been through these events. The ones who had the most success had an established relationship, a process, and trust. They weren't just randomly picking up the phone and calling someone to try to get them to come out and help. So put a process in place. It's also helpful to put in place rapid contracting options for rapid response. Maybe this is emergency contract mechanisms where we look at time and materials and we can get folks out there really quickly to repair the road and get it open to traffic and not slow users down from being able to access goods and medical services and things like that. So my example of this actually takes place up in Alaska. You guys might remember, if you think back in 2018, there was a major magnitude 7 earthquake up outside of Anchorage. This is a pretty radical picture that you see here of the highway. You actually see a product of a slope failure, and it completely crumbled this road. Now, Alaska is not, the resilience issue is not new to them. They deal with crazy temperatures. They deal with water and snow and flooding. They deal with earthquakes. There's not a lot we can do for a pavement to consider an earthquake. We can design our bridges to withstand them, our buildings to withstand them. The pavement structure, it's a little harder to plan for and design it in such a way that it can withstand the earthquake. So in this case, they have an earthquake, they have a failure. This is a picture of what I imagine was a very terrified motorist. I can't imagine what it would be like to be headed to work, or in this case, this is a feeder to the airport in Anchorage. Earthquake happens and my car literally drops in a hole. Big problem. Again, this is a key in and out for the airport. Within 4 days, they had responded and had repairs that when I say this, by the way, 4 days and the pavement was open. So 4 days after the event, within hours, the contractor was on site getting things going. One of the reasons it took a little while is because it was really cold and they weren't paving. And so they had to get their binder tanks up to temp to heat their asphalt binder so that they could get it out there. The DOT was literally writing the contract as the contractors worked. They were basing it off of time and materials on normal time and materials data. But there was a relationship here. Now, it's important to realize too, when these types of events happen, this is these people's community. Whether you're with the agency, whether you're with the industry, the end of the day, this is where you live. And so not only are you worried about the infrastructure, you're thinking about your house, how's my house? And so people were very interested in helping each other and getting things off the ground, but they already had some of these mechanisms in place. So it removed some of the potential issues and roadblocks and red tape they would have to get through. So we're able to get back rapidly. Then our last one that I want to point to is abandonment. Again, this is when we accept that it's sometimes the most fiscally responsible thing to abandon a route altogether. This can take many forms, such as complete abandonment, ultimately forcing the community to relocate. Let's talk about sustainability for a minute and social impact. If you force a community to relocate, there's some serious equity questions there. Not to mention, if you look statistically, people who live in most vulnerable areas are often people who are poor or of a lower socioeconomic status. So there's some major equity things that we really need to consider that if we go the abandonment route. Abandonment of the future route could also look like rerouting, which can be really inconvenient. It might go from a 10-minute drive to work to a 30-minute drive to work, but that is a possibility. It also may cost a lot of money, but it's just not worth going out there and repairing the road once a month due to flooding and things like that. And by the way, this is starting to happen more and more up and down the coast as we face sea level rise issues. Sunny day nuisance flooding is a regular thing that's occurring. I think you're going to hear about that potentially from a fellow from Delaware DOT in one of the future webinars. This is a picture of, I'm going to probably destroy this name, but Kivalina, Alaska. This is a community. It's been there for a very long time, and it is at risk of being completely cut off due to sea level rise. At what point do they move and where do they go? This is something that we need to be thinking about. This is a potential problem we can face. All right, so walk through kind of these 4 philosophies. Now let's shift gears. What are the keys to building resilience? I mentioned this earlier. One of the most important things we can do is partner. Agencies, industries, academia, we need to all be working together and building partnerships. We need to be communicating, building trust that we can afford trust before, during, and after a disruption. This is something that was hammered home time and time again when I was talking to agencies and industry folks who had been through these projects and gotten through them successfully. Another thing we need to do is plan. We need to come up with solutions now for how we're going to adapt and respond to climate disruptions. So one thing we could do is perform a network vulnerability study. If you look up vulnerability studies or vulnerability framework and FHWA, you'll see that they give a framework for doing a vulnerability study. They have a number of case studies that you can take a look at and how they were applied to different regions and different states. For various routes, we need to determine what our best adaptation philosophy would be. So these are the 4 philosophies I talked about. We need to prioritize based on that. And then what we need to do is build resilience thinking into our maintenance and rehab schedules. So we need to be thinking as we go out, we have regular rehab as a part of the life cycle of our pavements and our bridge infrastructure. We regularly go out to do maintenance and rehabilitation. We need to be thinking about whether or not there are things we can do within that budget now that will make it more resilient to potential future disruptions. We also need to think about things like alternative routes if an asset is compromised. We need to try to do that to eliminate potential cascading events. And that really might fall back into your vulnerability study and understanding the risks, thinking about cascading events and cascading effects. You need to think about rapid contracting options. We need to understand those and see how we might be able to put those in place. And then we also need to think about how we might address materials production facility resilience. So we need to not only consider the road, we need to consider about what we need to build the road back. Maybe this is the agency facility that folks are working out of, the war room, if you will, and to get back to action. We need to think about how to make sure we have those facilities set up and able to operate in these types of events. And then this is one of the most important takeaways today. Resilience does not have to be this new intimidating thing that we have to tackle. We have tools already at our fingertips that can be used today to make our infrastructure more resilient. There are things that you may be already doing in your company. If not, there are things that that are already out there that you can get on board with quickly that we know work. So let's talk about a few of those. And I refer to these as kind of tools for resilience. What can we do already? We already have rapid construction. We know that there are techniques that can be used to rapidly get the system moving again. I showed the example in Alaska, rebuilding the pavement within hours. We can use warm mix asphalt as a way to get mixed to the site despite heavy traffic or the compromising of an asphalt system. We can look at cold weather concreting for cold situations. There's lots of different solutions out there that we can use to get the infrastructure back up quickly without having to wait a very long time. We also need to think about pavement design. We can use existing design tools and pavement systems to resist distress. Things like long life pavements or perpetual pavement systems. This is something that's already being done to handle traffic. One of the folks at at the workshop I hosted, Amanda Gilliland with the TransTech Group, she made a really good point in her presentation to that workshop. She said, the way I look at it is we've kind of already been designing our pavements to be resilient to traffic all along. If you think about pavement design, we say, what's the traffic today? What's it going to be in the future? We need to design it to be able to handle that and mitigate the damage due to that and take care of it completely. How do we adapt our pavements to be more resilient to climate disruptions as well? Think about climate adaptable materials. I kind of chuckle, like asphalt, we use a PG grading system. We're literally designing and picking our asphalt binder materials based on climate. So we already have that down. What about using things like polymers, using things like fibers? How might we be able to employ some of these technologies that we think about to resist rutting or cracking for resisting extreme temperature changes or extreme lows or extreme high temps that we might see? These don't have to be things that are super hard to implement. We can implement them now. Think about using maintenance schedules. We can't always go in and rebuild a pavement, but what we can do is say, hey, we're going to go out and we're going to mill 2 inches and replace it with 2 inches. What if we go out and just mill 1 inch and replace it with 2 inches? We're not going to pay any more money. We've just increased the thickness of that pavement by 1 inch and we've moved it closer to a perpetual pavement. As long as we don't leave any cracks underneath it, should work just fine. And it's built within our standard maintenance schedule, so it doesn't cost us anything extra. Now, there's other considerations. There might be some folks out there who are like, yeah, man, that's great, except for the fact that we have bridge clearances to think about. And I get that. You can't apply any one of these tools. It's an important takeaway. None of these tools is a one-size-fits-all silver bullet for resilience. We have to apply them in the right places. Think about things like porous pavement. We're all familiar with that. That can help with stormwater. It can help with mitigation. Recycling, a key is that sometimes our supply chain is disrupted as well. We don't have the materials available to us due to the disruption that we've experienced. Well, I work a lot with asphalt. Asphalt's 100% recyclable. I do cold recycling work. That literally is 100% recycled material. You can do a high wrap mix. You can get that pavement back open quickly using the materials that might have been compromised in the event to begin with. So using those recycled materials on site or nearby to get the pavement up and running again. And then finally, things like deep reconstruction with full depth reclamation. This is a cost-effective way to go out and rebuild the pavement base. You can do an FDR up to 14 inches thick. So if you have a 6-inch pavement that's been dealing with a lot of flood inundation and failing prematurely, go out, mill the surface off, run the FDR, put 14 inches down, and then put a surface on top. All of a sudden, you've gone from 6 inches of structure to 6 or 8 inches, rather, because you're going to have an aggregate base to, 15, 20 inches. I mean, you've significantly made that structure much bigger. You've also stiffened it to withstand flood inundation and things like that. So these are just some of the tools. Every one of these is something you've probably heard of or seen, but we don't think about them in a resilience context. So they can be used today. So what do we need? Funding. This is the number one thing every person in an agency I've talked to has said. Funding. We need funding to build resilience into the system. We need funding for emergency response and resilient building. We need to be able to build it back better. Did not mean to borrow from what Larry was talking about earlier in President Biden's infrastructure plan. That, if that goes through, will help address some of this, it sounds like. But this is something that everyone I've talked to has said, we need to make sure we have funding available to do this. We're already doing so much with limited dollars. We need guidance. So what are the best practices? What are methods for building resilience into the system? The resilience space in the pavements community until the last couple of years has been relatively limited. If you look at the transportation area as a whole, there's been a lot of work done looking at vulnerability of the system, looking at how people move and things like that. That's been done, and there's a lot of experience. There's still a lot of work to be done in that area. But pavements themselves, we're still figuring out exactly what the right solutions are. And then we also need, hey, I'm an academic, I know. I like to think of myself as a pracademic coming from a practical background, but we have research needs. We need to understand, how do we incorporate climate models into our design? If you look at the way we design our pavements today, we use historical climate data. We say, all right, what was the last 30, 40 years like from the 50s on? But we're not dealing with disruptions that are caused by previous climate. We're dealing with disruptions that are triggered by changing climate. So as the climate changes for one reason or another, we see more disruptions. As we see the jet stream dip further south, we see cold fronts moving further south, things we're not used to seeing, or simply warmer ocean leads to more hurricanes. How do we incorporate future climate into our current design practices? And there's a lot of work going on this. There's a lot of resolution issues with this, because climate modelers, they're looking at the whole wide world. We're looking at a project that's 6 miles long. So their grid points are totally different. So work needs to be done to figure out how to incorporate that into our design process. We need to understand new types of failure so that we can design around them. So I think there's a lot of things that we're dealing with now that frankly weren't considered when we built our design process. I'm not aware of any of the AASHTO road tests where the AASHTO 93 design process came from, or the LTPP sites that are used to calibrate pavement ME, where the pavement was all underwater a couple times a year. If it was an accident. It was not planned, and it definitely wasn't calibrated for that. So we have an idea of what that failure is like, but we've never really studied it to understand deterioration rates and things like that so they can be accounted for. We need to develop new technologies and new techniques to help us adapt. So I laid out a lot of tools we already have. That is great news. There are more that we can be doing. I believe in innovation and creativity. Many of you do. This is our opportunity to think creatively, come up with new solutions. And then finally, we need to build resilience into our decision-making, whether that's through life cycle cost analysis or potentially life cycle assessment, which is a sustainability or environmental accounting process. I think there's probably a place in both. Life cycle cost analysis is probably the most natural place because agencies are using that all the time, and there is cost associated with risk and disruption. Now, if you want to learn more, just today, I got the email that this report shown on the right has officially been published. It's from the National Asphalt Pavement Association and the work they sponsored. It's entitled Resilient Asphalt Pavements, Industry Solutions for a Resilience Goal. This PDF will be posted. You can follow this link. If you go to NAPA's website, go to their store. It's on their homepage or their front page on their store. I'm sure you could search the title. It'll probably come up. I haven't done that yet. So take a look at that. We have a forthcoming NCAT report, 2102, which is not out yet. This report is a shorter version of that report. That report is much more exhaustive and covers all the content from our workshop, which spanned industry through agencies, academics, and FHWA. AASHTO had a lot of folks at that workshop that spoke and talked about resilience of pavements. So be sure to check that out. So with that said, I would be happy to take any questions. If you don't want to ask now, or you get to thinking about this, my email address is here at the bottom, bfbowers@auburn.edu. Love to talk to you. If you have any interesting case studies or things like that, I'd love to learn about it. And again, I really appreciate you having me here today.
Ben, we do have a couple of questions, and thank you so much for being with us today. Can't thank you enough for that. Great presentation.
Absolutely.
One of the questions we have is how a transportation agency can reevaluate the resiliency level of existing payments, how the agency will improve the resilience, how will the resilience be included in the agency specs, whole lot of questions, and how the expensive could the resilient payment be compared to a non-resilient?
Right. Yeah. So that was like 6 questions there.
Yeah.
What was the first one? And maybe I'll kind of
how a transportation agency can evaluate the resilience level of existing pavement.
Yeah. So the first thing I would do is take a look at the specific pavement that you're thinking about, assess what the potential disruptions are to it. If you're in the coast, you might be worrying about flooding or next to a river, or you might be thinking about cascading events because you're a parallel road that's further inland. Take an assessment of that and look at the vulnerability. Again, I would recommend you take a look at the FHWA vulnerability framework. Look at that structure and think about what it might be subjected to and run some analysis on it. If it seems like it's something that may fail prematurely, then that gets to your next question, which is, what solutions do I have in my toolbox? And again, this is going to be pavement specific. It's going to depend on if I have maintenance coming up, is there something I can use to adapt it some more? Or do I need to be considering putting a true hardening piece of gray infrastructure in place or something like that? So take a look at that and run that cost analysis. Right now, there is not a way to build this into LCCA. This is where I think it's most naturally going to be implemented for our agencies, thinking about it from an LCCA framework. Assess the risk of the disruption. You can look at the cost of a repair using historical data and look at the cost of doing something now or in the near future to upgrade it and trying to balance that risk to get rid of the potential failure. And then run that analysis out and see what the cost benefit is to make that decision. That's how I would approach it. And that's kind of some of the preliminary work I'm doing with some of my colleagues is moving down that route. In terms of policy and things like that, I know that's, as an agency, it's like the practical implication and the policy implications are linked, but those are sometimes 2 different sets of decision makers. And the budgeting practices that fall in there, I think we really need to understand the vulnerability so that we can shape our policy around that so that we can start incorporating it into LCCA and things like that. So there's a lot, unfortunately, that we don't know yet, which is, again, how is our payment going to fail? How can we build it into LCCA? I've got ideas, but again, if you look through the literature, a lot of them have not been tackled yet. So I think did I hit all of those there, or was there
just one more on that out of that group?
Yes.
How expensive would a resilient pavement be compared to one that's not resilient?
That is going to be totally dependent on the pavement you're designing. I think that there are cases where it can be no more expensive. I'll give an example. Let's say you have a coastal route that is in need of some form of reconstruction. When I was at VDOT, reconstruction was 4 inches or more. So 4 inches of manipulation of the material. So we got to do that anyway. Like regardless of flooding or not flooding, the pavement's old, we need to take care of it. What if you go out and you use some kind of reclamation, some recycling? You can do a reconstruction, in some cases cheaper. Right now, and again, this is not necessarily thinking from resilience. I've been a part of a project in Virginia where they're rebuilding Interstate 64. The cheapest option was to use FDR, cold central plant recycling, and hot mix compared to a complete hot mix or a complete concrete option for rebuilding that interstate. And so that's what they're doing. So I think that there are ways that we can build our pavement more resilient for equal or less money potentially. There's obviously going to be situations where it costs more. The degree to which it costs more, again, is going to be very dependent on the solution. There are places where they've elevated roads and spent millions and millions and millions of dollars on elevating that road because they felt that that was the best option that they had, and they had to do something immediately. But I think as we think and understand better how to make our pavements more resilient, we're going to be able to come up with some more cost-effective solutions. We just need to be able to think out of the box and apply some of the tools I was talking about earlier. I didn't mention every tool that's out there. There are probably things that you can come up with that I've never considered. So put on that resilience thinking cap, think about the different solutions that you may have that you may be able to use, and you can bring that cost down significantly. So I'm sorry, I know that's probably a little bit, I don't mean to give a wishy-washy answer, but as we know, every project's different and the costs associated can vary. So I would just challenge you to look at it, come up with as many solutions as you can, and see if there's one that's maybe even cheaper than what you would traditionally do.
I know in talking to my counterpart in Virginia, Trenton Clark, good friend, talking to him, him and I were talking about what was going on out there on the interstate with the FDR and the cold central plant recycling, and how that project is really gone. It really has progressed very well. And the cost has been really down there what they would consider. So I'll vouch for that project. Another question: are there any test sections on the test track that include resilient pavement? And the question is, I mean, other than the perpetual pavement sections, which I've got to brag a little bit about Oklahoma section N9. Basically, the core of that asphalt has over 50 million easels now on it, and so that's something we can hang our hat on for sure of how successful it is. And that it's actually it was actually a project that was here in Oklahoma, and they replicated it down there at the track that was placed in 2006, and it's still performing, still looking great. It's actually State Highway 152 between Council and MacArthur. So we've seen that success there also.
Yeah, I'm glad. First of all, Larry, I'm glad you gave a shout out to and forgive me, it just thundered. So if you hear rumbling, that's the storm is here. I'm glad you gave a shout out to the Oklahoma sections. We're very appreciative of that partnership, and it's been interesting to watch those experiments progress, and they're doing really well. To answer the question about resilient pavement sections, the answer is no. Currently, there are not, but there are plans. As usual, if we can get adequate funding, I put a plan together where we would actually try to build some sections off one of the off ramps. So not on the track itself, but on an off ramp that we could flood. And I'm interested in looking at a number of different things, whether it's different soil types and their drainage characterizations, because that's a problem. If your pavement floods, as soon as the water subsides, people want to drive on it. Well, if that base is still saturated, how much damage is being done to the pavement, and what does it do to your deterioration curve? And based on user costs and delays, can you do an economic analysis to determine how long you need to wait in order, or where the break-even point is to wait for that pavement or that soil to drain so that you can load it again? So looking at some different soils, and then also potentially, or another idea or building on that, is employing some of these tools for resilience that I talked about, and trying to identify what tools do the best job, or what varying degrees in a flooded pavement type situation. Again, flooded pavements being the number one thing folks have talked about being concerned about, so that we can put some kind of economic value on it. So as you as an agency are deciding what tool to employ, you can do that cost analysis and figure out what makes the most sense. And thinking about the risk associated, maybe it does make sense to use a little more expensive product, or maybe there's a cheaper product that does just as well that you could use today. So if anybody's interested in talking about that, please send me a note. I used to have a slide in this. I took it out for the purposes of today, just because I knew my audience was probably going to be very diverse. But if anybody's talking about that, I would love to talk to you about that. And we're building momentum around that concept right now, and we're hoping to be able to do that because I think it would answer a lot of critical questions. I'll note the reason we would put it on the off ramp is one, so we don't compromise any sections like Oklahoma. You can imagine flooding our giant asset out there could be a little risky. But the other reason is because we'll be able to load the heavy trucks on it. But frankly, if I put we're not going to deal with pavements that are underwater constantly, that we're running fully loaded, legally loaded tractor trailers on over and over and over for 10 million easels. So this would be more representative, just doing an off ramp of what the traffic may look like. It'll also allow us to get in there and run some testing while we're trafficking that we wouldn't be able to do if we were trying to get out on the track. So thank you for asking that question. I wasn't gonna throw that out there today, but like I said, if anybody wants to talk about it, please shoot me an email.
Okay, another question. What would be a rapid construction option for a cold place like Alaska in the wintertime?
Yeah, so that example that I showed a minute ago, it was wintertime there. And so for them, they were able to somehow, I think it's because they use such a soft binder, they didn't actually have to use a warm mix additive, which surprised me when I interviewed the fellow from Alaska DOT, who hopefully you guys will get to hear from in a few weeks later. You mentioned trying to get some of those folks on. But, you know, the biggest challenge for them was just getting the binder tank hot enough. And so once they got it hot enough, they were able to get out there and place the asphalt. So that for them was considered rapid, you know, to be able to get that road completely rebuilt. Keep in mind, by the way, something I didn't mention is the fact that part of the reason it failed was that they had a drainage issue and a drainage pipe that went under that section of road in that slope. So they had to replace that, backfill so they could bring it back up, and then put the asphalt down. So they were able to do that in 4 days. If it's super cold, you know, I would, from an asphalt perspective, I'd start using warm mix additives to make sure you can get adequate compaction, and that could help handle those temperature variations. So those would be things I would think about. I'd also be interested in looking at whether or not there are some other recycling techniques and things that you could use with emulsions or things like that too, that at least could get you by until you were able to build the pavement structure you really want and need there. The key is to be able to get the traffic moving, get people moving quickly. So.
Thank you very much, Ben. Any other questions from folks? Put it in the chat deal and we'll get it asked. We got just about, we got a few more minutes that we can take care of this. And while anybody else adds something to it, I would like to say that on April the 20th, at the same time frame, we're going to have Elizabeth Haybeck with FHWA. She's going to be talking about how they look at resiliency from their aspect of it. And I know that Ben has presented with her before on the Napa one. So.
Yeah, she'll give a great presentation, give you a good national perspective on what FHWA is doing and thinking and some of the progress they've made.
Well, I don't see any other questions. So Ben, thank you very much for being here. We appreciate it so much. Dr. Zaman, I'll turn it back over to you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Ben, let me also add my congratulations to you for the outstanding job. This is such an important and timely topic. I think we may decide to ignore it, but the severe weather and climate extremes will not ignore us and will not ignore our pavement. So this is very, very informative. We greatly appreciate your presentation. As I indicated in the beginning, that we will be putting a PDF of your presentation on our website. Also, we'll catalog your presentation as a record. And for the audience, I think we do it for you. I think it is a great opportunity, to cover topics that are important. So please, if you want to see any topics, covered in future. I'm not asking for money, but let us know, what topic you'd like to see presented and who you think will be the person to present it. And again, I'm thankful to Larry for recruiting Ben, and I'm thankful to all of you for taking your time out of, I'm sure that you have a lot of other things to do, to attend this. And you will be receiving your PDH. If you do not receive it, please let us know, and you will have one. So Ben, again, I want to thank you, and Larry, thank you for having Ben. It has been a wonderful experience. We appreciate it very much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me today. This was great.
Bye.
And Dr. Zaman, thank you very much for letting us be a part of this. I appreciate it so much.
Always, Larry. It's a pleasure working with you and others. Thank you.
Thank you.